I have the great pleasure on behalf of everyone of welcoming you, Apurav and Xavier Sachidas, who's a colleague from, of course, the economics department here at Ashoka. Apurav is a PhD student in economics at the University of Warwick. He works primarily on political economy and labor economics. And before that, he studied economics at the Toulouse School of Economics in France. Did his bachelor's degree in economics again at IIT Kharagpur. And so from a engineering sort of environment, he's turned economist. Now whether he knows it or not, he's turning into a political scientist, and perhaps one day you will finally become a philosopher. But in the meantime, we're very happy to have you to talk about this topic, which for us is of great interest for a number of reasons. Political, because obviously, all being here in India, the question of simultaneous elections is something we've been grappling with as an idea, as a discussion for a while. But also because there is a lot of cool data and nice, interesting use of data, behind the argument that you and your co-author are building. And so thank you very much for doing this. And the floor is yours for what if 35, 40 minutes max. And then we'll have questions. We'll be taking questions essentially through the chat box, keeping them towards the end, right? And Aishwarya will moderate those questions. So
thank you, Jill. Thank you for the kind words and invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Apurav Bhatia. I'm a PhD student in economics at the University of Warwick. Today, I'm going to talk about synchronized elections and how it affects voter behavior and governance outcomes. This is a joint work with Sabyasachi Das from Ashoka and with Vimal Balasubramaniam, who is from the Queen Mary University of London. I apologize if I'm looking here and there because I have multiple screens. So yeah. So a lot of countries around the world are holding synchronized elections, and that is the election for multiple layers of government, which happen on the same day at the same time, while Europe and India are seriously considering holding synchronized elections. In the European context, the idea is to synchronize the elections for the European national governments and the European parliaments. And right now, in fact, there is a debate that's ongoing in South Africa to also synchronize the elections. The Indian context, the debate is to synchronize the elections for the parliament and the state assembly constituencies. You might have heard of the phrase one nation, one election. And the current Law Commission of India, the Election Commission, and the current ruling party are all in favor of this proposal. So what are the pros and cons of having synchronized elections? So the arguments in the favor of synchronized elections suggest that it will save a lot of money because there is a huge cost for political parties and for candidates to participate in the elections, as well as for the governments to organize these elections. Another argument is that it would lead to better policy coordination between the center and the state, which might otherwise not be possible if there are recurrent elections and the model code of conduct is imposed. If you simply think about the year 2019, then May saw the general elections, and then last year we also had the state assembly elections for Jharkhand, Maharashtra, and Haryana. So the argument is that it's taken away from effective government functioning, and the elected officials are doing an excessive focus on election campaigning than performing their primary duties. It looks like we should not hold elections every year. But if you hold synchronized elections, it could potentially result in centralization of power, and it could dilute the structure of the government. What we argue is that the central point that this entire debate ignores is that when voters make decision, either they make it simultaneously, it may affect how they actually vote. And that's the main starting point of our research on synchronized elections. We examined the national and state assembly elections in India between 1977 and 2018. And we asked the first question: does synchronization of elections lead to significant changes in voter behavior and consequently on the electoral and economic outcomes? We do this by exploiting the variation in the synchronization of state elections over time. So for any general election, only a subset of assembly constituencies are synchronized. They happen on the same day. And moreover, the national and state governments sometimes do not complete their full term. So that also gives us a over time variation in synchronization. So we exploit this over time and across state variation and synchronization to understand the effects. To tease out the effect of synchronization, we compare the synchronized elections with those which happen within 180 days of each other. The idea is to compare the synchronized elections with those proximate elections which happen close together, but they still are not quite far away from each other, because a lot of different economic and political effects can kick in if you compare elections which are far away from each other. To identify the mechanisms, we propose a model of behaviorally constrained voters, and we tested using post-poll survey data. To show you a glimpse of this, we find that synchronized elections increases the probability that same political party wins at the parliamentary constituency and assembly constituency by 9.3, which is about 21% of the base probability of 0.43. We find the results are driven by state parties and actually not by the national parties. We find synchronization of elections increases the salience of parties in voter preferences. It reduces split ticket voting. It shifts the voters' priority to state issues, and the turnout and the win margin are not significantly different between synchronized and the unsynchronized elections. We also analyze the economic effects of synchronized elections, and we are measuring it using agricultural production, private and public investment activity, and night lights. We find insignificant economic gains on all of these dimensions due to synchronized elections. The academic literature studying synchronized elections has primarily the US and the European countries. These countries have a clear hierarchy in their prominence, and the elected national governments usually are the first order elections, which are most important, and elections for the local governments are usually deemed second order in nature. So due to this election hierarchy, the literature has mainly focused on changes in turnout at the local election level when they're thinking of the effects of synchronized elections. Some of the work in this context is Graham 2016 in the context of Germany, and Cantoni and Gazzi 2019 in the context of Italy. Consequently, so any changes in electoral outcomes that you study in these contexts are driven by changes in turnout that you see. So while the current debate on synchronized elections in India, in both Europe and India, on elections which are both first order, and that's very different from the current academic literature. And in the Indian context, any hierarchy of elections between the general elections and the state assembly elections, and we find these negligible differences in turnout in the Indian context. Therefore, any differences that you see in electoral outcomes due to synchronized elections could actually be driven by changes in voter behavior. We also contribute to the behavioral science literature. The literature suggests that in choice experiments with simultaneity, there occurs a diversification bias. We study this choice experiments in the electoral context, and we find that simultaneity of choice leads to a reduction in diversification. The roadmap of today's presentation is as follows. I will go through the context and data. Then I will explain you the research design, empirical strategy, and show you the results. Next, I will discuss the mechanisms. And lastly, I'll discuss the economic effects of synchronization. Now, let me go through the context of the elections quickly, which I'm, of course, confident this audience is quite familiar. India has 543 parliamentary constituencies across 4,000 and about 4,300 state assembly constituencies. An important thing here is that each assembly constituency is subsumed within a parliamentary constituency. So it can be uniquely mapped to the parliamentary constituency. In India, there are about, on average, 8 assembly constituencies for every parliamentary constituency. Our study covers a period from 1977 to 2018. We start with 1977 as this is the first general election after the exercise of delimitation commission in 1973. And also right after the independence, the elections for the national and state government in India were synchronized. But due to the early dissolution of some state governments and the central government in the late 60s and early 70s, this entire cycle was unsynchronized. In this period from 1977 to 2018, we worked with those states which had at least one synchronized and at least one unsynchronized election. This gives us a sample of about 21 states, which covers a period of 10 general elections and about 168 state assembly elections. In this paper, we combine data from multiple sources. Our primary source of data is the national and state election records, which comes from the kind host of these workshops, Trivedi Center of Political Data at Ashoka. combine the CM electoral data to the TCPD data just to get the exact election date, which is useful to find the synchronized and the unsynchronized elections. We also make use of individual level post-poll election surveys, which come from Lokniti CSTS. We access the relevant questions from the national and state election surveys since 1996. And these questions provide us a wealth of data on voter information, attitude, decisions, and along with individual level socioeconomic characteristics. To understand the changes in economic outcomes, we use data from 3 separate sources. We use Nightlight's data for the overall economic activity from NOA. We use the census data to get information on literacy, employment, and agricultural labor. And we use data from CE to get information on capital expenditures by government and private sources, agricultural activity in India, and the credit dispersed by RBI. In our main data set, a unit of observation is the state assembly constituency, which is mapped to the parliamentary constituency election past. A figure of election pairs by distance times looks something like this, where the 0 days between the GE means that the election was synchronized, while a positive gap would tell you that how many days after the general election was the state assembly election scheduled. A standard approach of estimating the effect of synchronized elections would be to compare the electoral outcomes between the synchronized elections and the that is, you take the all elections which had a time gap of 0 days as the synchronized elections, and or the treated group, let's say, and all positive gap in days as the control group. The problem is that if you compare elections which happened across large time differences from the general election, it might other effects which kick in apart from the synchronized election effect. The underlying political and economic structure could actually be very different between those 2 elections. Their alternative approach. We compare the synchronized elections with the unsynchronized elections, which are in close proximity to the general election. So the control group to the elections which happen within 180 days after the general election. Our regression specification looks as follows. As an outcome variable, we measure if the same party was elected at the assembly constituency A, subsumed within a parliamentary constituency P in the state S for a general election year T. The coefficient of interest, gamma, captures the effect of synchronization of a state on the change in the probability that same party wins a seat at the parliamentary and assembly constituency. This specification includes parliamentary constituency fixed effects to account for unobserved differences across constituencies with time. So any synchronization effect that we capture from gamma would actually be within each parliamentary constituency. The regression also controls for fixed effects for each general election year, which accounts for unobserved differences which are specific to each general election, which will have similar effects on all constituencies. The regression also controls for reservation status of the constituencies. We cluster the standard errors by at the state by GE year level, and we weight point estimates by the size of for the assembly constituency. This weighting is done because the synchronized elections and the unsynchronized elections happened at different points in time, which had very different electorate sizes. We have done a bunch of robustness tests to test our regression specification, and I will cover them in a few slides right after I show you the main results. Now, in this figure, we show the effect of synchronization on the probability that same party wins a seat at the parliamentary and the assembly constituency. The comparison is made between synchronized elections and the unsynchronized elections, which happen at any time after the general election. That's a standard approach. The left panel, the sync equals 0, shows the average value across constituencies of India for the unsynchronized elections. And for the right panel, sync equals 1, it depicts the same synchronized election. Comparison of the two map clearly shows that the probability that same party wins a seat at both tiers, it goes up significantly when elections are synchronized. Score 0 and 1 is divided into 3 color bands equally, yellow, orange, and red. And you see a clear movement in the color bands. There are significantly more constituencies in the right panel which are colored red, signifying an increase in probability, and they are in the highest band, 0.66 to 1. Moreover, you see this increase which is happening, it is uniform across the country, and it doesn't look it's driven by any specific region. The regions in the map, which are in white color, it signals those states which never had a synchronized election after 1977. To make this comparison sharper, we are now comparing the synchronized elections with those unsynchronized elections, which happened within 180 days of each other. In this table, we show the results in a standard regression format. The first three shows for the all days sample, and we saw the results from the column 3 pictorially in the last slide. In the columns 4, 5, and 6, we show the effect of synchronization on a sample that's restricted to 180 days. The point estimate in column 4 is 9.7 percentage points, which only drops slightly when we include the GE year fixed effects and controls to the regression in columns 5 and 6. Our main result comes from column 6, which tells us from unsynchronized elections increases the probability that same party wins a seat at the assembly and the parliamentary constituency by 9.3 percentage points. This effect is significantly large, and as compared to the mean dependent variable 0.43 shown at the bottom of the table, the effect is about 21%. This 180-day sample states and has about 40 clusters. Now you may wonder why we take 180 days. So as to estimate the effect of synchronization using those unsynchronized elections, which are in close proximity to the general election, to avoid other political and economic changes affecting our outcome variable. In this table, we weigh the time difference from the general election and we plot the gamma coefficient from the regression along with the 95% confidence interval. And if you keep aside the 150 days, which has just 4 states in it, we see as we increase the time gap by 30 days initially and by 120 days beyond the first 360 days, we find this increase in time gap makes very little difference to the point estimate in our as compared to the main 180-day sample. And even doubling the time gap from 180 to 360 days doesn't change the main results very much. Moving on to robustness. In this figure, we show a bunch of different point estimate 95% confidence interval when we conduct the robustness test. The leftmost panel, PCFE, shows the main results with the parliamentary constituency fixed effects for a comparison checks. In the ACFE, we include the assembly constituency fixed effects to control for heterogeneity within across within each parliamentary constituency. Next, we also include for time trends for both the parliamentary and the assembly constituency. This accounts for over of the constituencies. You see this inclusion of time trends also makes very little difference to the regression specification. It makes the tangent and it actually drops the point estimate only slightly. Now we have about 40 clusters in our 180-day sample. So we re-estimate the standard bootstrap to account for this, and the standard errors widen when we do this, but it still remains significant at the 5% level. The boundaries for some of the constituencies once in our time period between 1977 and 2018. So we drop all the elections which happened after May 2000, re-estimate the regression. So we find that even then the point estimate and 95% confidence interval is quite similar to our main result, which is in the left column. We also drop the weights that we had introduced in the regression, and even that hardly makes a difference. We also include the elections which happened within 180 days general election, both before, and even this robustness hardly makes a difference and actually makes the confidence interval smaller. In the last column, we account for the solution. So we drop those state assembly elections which got synchronized or unsynchronized due to an early resolution of the state assembly election, but was following its full cycle. And we see the results actually become slightly stronger by increasing the point estimate. We conduct a few more robustness tests. So first, if we estimate if the synchronized election effect happened by chance. So to test for this argument, we 10,000 simulations where we randomly assign the synchronized status to the state assembly elections in our sample, and we plot the distribution of point estimate. So from there also we conclude that the effect did not happen by chance. Next, we test for the argument that synchronization still captures some proximity effect, and we do a placebo test for this. So we drop all the synchronized elections from our data set, and we redefine the synchronized elections in 2 ways. First, we assume that the elections which happened within the first 90 days to be synchronized, while the elections which happened from the first 91 days to 180 days to be the ones which are synchronized, and we re-estimate the synchronization effect. And second, we do the same exercise while we take the elections which happened in the first 30 to 120 days of the general election synchronized, while those from 120 to 210 days to be unsynchronized. And as you can see in this table, we find null effects in both the cases. This test confirmed that there's something specific to holding the elections on the same day, which causes the same party to win across both tiers, and it is not a proximity effect that's driving the results. Now, before moving on to the mechanisms, I want to show you one more result, the effect of synchronized elections by party type and by incumbency. So in panel A, we modify the outcome variable as same party at the assembly and the parliamentary constituency, and if the party is classified as national, state, unrecognized, or independent, as defined by the Election Commission of India at the time of election. We find it is the state parties which gain the most from synchronized elections, and the national parties actually do not exhibit any gains from synchronization. Next, in panel B, modify the outcome variable as same party at the assembly and the parliamentary constituency, and the party is incumbent from central government, state government, or incumbent at the state assembly constituency only, but which might not be in the government. We find that the state government incumbent parties tend to gain from synchronization of elections. Now, in the following section, I will discuss the mechanisms, and I will start by ruling out some rational mechanisms before I jump on to the behavioral choice model. First, voters may rationally choose their voting strategy when the elections are synchronized, as defined over a bundle of candidates are defined in a non-separable way. So this can happen when a voter's preference for one candidate is in one election is contingent on the outcome of the other election. And when the elections are sequential, voters with non-separable preferences can actually decide based on the outcome of the last election. In the Indian context, we know from the work of Nellis 2016 that BJP is more likely to see following a win at the parliamentary constituency, while the same for INC is not is negative. So we test our if our results are different in INC, and we find no such differences. So we rule out this channel. Another plausible explanation is that our results are anti-incumbency in the synchronized versus the sequential ones. And now anti-incumbency is a well-documented phenomenon in Indian elections. Now this effect says that the party wins reduces as we move from synchronized to sequential elections. So the possibility of across-tier anti-incumbency is higher in sequential elections, and it should likely strengthen over time as there is more time elapsed between the two elections. But as you can see in this figure, we find that when the estimated coefficient actually remains quite stable when the time gap goes between the general elections and the state assembly elections. So we rule out the anti-incumbency also as one of the mechanisms driving the effect. Now, our results could also occur because of coattail effects, and it's actually well documented in the academic literature. So in this phenomena, a salient candidate from one election could attract the votes for candidates of their party when the other election is held simultaneously. Now, this effect is typically observed in elections which have a clear hierarchy. But in the Indian elections, this hierarchy is not clear. So we look for the coattail effects, which occur from prominent parliamentary constituency candidates to the assembly constituency candidates, and from the prominent assembly constituency candidates to prominent parliamentary constituency candidates. And we do this by identifying the constituencies which have a higher win margin. And we decompose the synchronization effect, which is coming from the constituencies which have a higher win margin with the remaining ones. And the results suggest that the synchronization effect is not driving our results. Sorry, the coattail effect is not driving the results. Political parties can also exploit economies of scale in their campaigning, and they might be better equipped to lower the per capita expenditure of public outreach. So simply, this would tell us that the estimated synchronization effect is driven by the supply side changes. So we use the Lokniti post-poll survey, and we find that there is a reason political campaigning when synchronized elections happen. And we capture it from the question, did a party worker visit your house to ask for votes? But we know that the national parties have substantially more resources at their hand to expand their campaign activities. So if the supply side effect is the main channel, we should expect the results to be driven by the national parties rather than the state or the unrecognized parties. But we don't find that effect. So taking together, our evidence suggests that there are factors other than simple rational explanations that are driving our results. Now, to systematically evaluate the behavioral mechanisms at play, we first establish theoretical framework to study how the behavioral constraints can affect the voting decisions and consequently the electoral outcomes that come from there. In these slides, I'm going to give the gist of the model. So assume there are two candidates from two different parties, A and B, and the voter's utility from candidate C is a weighted average of their party affiliations and their personal characteristics. And the variable capture, the variable lambda, is capturing the important characteristics versus the personal characteristics in the utility function of the voter. Now, since parties play an important role in the election campaigning in India, we think party is a salient feature of the candidates, while there is a cost to acquire information on the personal characteristics of the candidates. So the personal characteristics could actually be a high dimensional object. So it could be a candidate's caste, religion, family details, income, wealth, etc. Now, if a voter does not acquire this additional information about the personal characteristics of the candidates, it means they're voting on the party identities. And we call this a party rationale for voting. But if the voters acquire information and they vote according to their true preference, we call it a preference rationale for voting. So we use the salience theory in economics, which proposes that the individual preferences might be distorted by the information of salient features of the object. So we apply the salience theory in the context of voting decision, and we show how certain informational and behavioral constraints can lead to higher salience of parties and voter preferences, and consequently it could influence the voting decision and electoral outcomes. Now think sequential elections. The voters are deciding independently in the two elections, and we consider two elections, let's say E and E prime, and the cost to acquire information kappa is higher for E prime as compared to E. So E prime could be a higher tier election. So for example, if you can think of the voters for the voters, it could be easier to acquire information on the assembly constituency candidates, where it would be very difficult to acquire personal information on the parliamentary constituency candidates. So using this model, we make a distribution of the preferences of voter between the party and the preference rationale. Now think in the context of a synchronized election. Voters are cognitively constrained to have just one rationale for voting in both the elections. And given the cost to acquire information on personal characteristics is rationale. And one of the results from the model that we get is that the fraction of voters engaged in split ticket voting goes down in synchronized elections as compared to the sequential ones. So next, we will examine the implication of this heightened salience of party and by focusing on split ticket voting. So as increase in split ticket voting would tell us there are cognitive constraints faced by the voters. So we start by testing the model predictions using the individual level post-poll survey data by Lokniti CSTS. So we combine all the national and state elections post-poll surveys done by the CSTS from 1966 to 2018. These surveys are asking several questions to randomly selected voters in a random sample of constituencies after the national and state assembly elections, but before the election results. And we focus on the questions from the survey, which are asked in all waves and are relevant to us. So there are three such questions. The first is, which party did you vote for in the assembly or general election? Then, what was the most important consideration for you while voting? Was it the party passed or not sure? And what do you think was the main issue for the elections? So we present the results on the first question. Which party did you vote for in the assembly or general election? The outcome variable is an indicator if the service said that they voted for the same party in the last general and state assembly election and zero otherwise. So using individual level voter information, the results in the column 1 tells us that after controlling for age, education, gender, social groups, and a matrix of asset ownership, we find voters are 7.1 percentage points more likely to report voted for the state assembly election when they were synchronized. Also remember these surveys were done right before the election results were announced. What we see is that the effect is quite similar as we see in the aggregate data. In the column 2 to 4, we interact the synchronization with age, gender, education, and we find that all interactions are actually small and statistically insignificant. This tells us that the fall in split ticket voting is uniform across voters of all kind, and the effect is not different between less sophisticated or less informed voters to some extent. The second question that we ask is, the second question we look at is, what is the most important consideration for the voter while voting? The options were party, candidates, caste, and not sure. So we checked the responses were systematically different between synchronized elections and the unsynchronized ones. So the maroon bar shows a comparison of the synchronized elections with the unsynchronized state elections, and the blue bar shows a comparison of the synchronized elections with the unsynchronized national elections. We find that the voters were 12 percentage points more likely to party after the synchronized elections. This is a large effect, as given that on average, about 46% of the respondents said party in the entire sample. So this argument is also consistent with our model above, which said that the voters are more likely to focus on salient aspects of the candidates, namely their party affiliations, during elections. Another relevant question in the survey was, what is the main issue for the elections? So we classified the responses based on whether the issue is a state subject or a national subject, as defined by the Constitution of India. The result is shown in the figure, and the options are national, state, don't know. We find that the respondents are 30 percentage points more likely to mention a state issue during synchronized elections as compared to the non-synchronized state elections. This effect is again consistent with the observation that the electoral outcomes is concentrated among the state parties. So our analysis up now shows that synchronized elections lead to significant changes in voter behavior, and it leads to same party winning both parliamentary and assembly. In the following section, I will investigate the effect of synchronized elections on the economic benefits to the constituency. Now, one reasoning that it could happen is that the synchronized representation across tiers of government is shown to have positive effects with regard to the allocation of public resources. So for example, the work of Rao and Singh and Khemani says that there are higher transfer of public resources from center to the state governments in India if the ruling party in both the governments is same. And the recent in Novasa tells us that the local economic impact of being represented by a politician of a ruling party is positive. So for analysis, we focus on economic activities. So we use the information on the database of capital investments in India, the CapEx database from the CEMIE, which monitors whether new project implementation and whether past projects have been completed as measures of economic activity in the constituency. We estimate the effect as an indicator variable for projects completed as well as projects which are under investment. And we also differentiate between the amount of investment and that's coming from the government and the private sources. So these regressions are done at the assembly constituency level. Next, we also use the data on agricultural activity and credit disbursement, both of which are at the district level. So we estimate how the agricultural production per capita, the gross cropped area per square kilometer of the district, and the credit dispersed per capita changes in response to synchronized elections and synchronized representation at the district level. And following Asher and Novosad 2017, we use nightlights as a measure of overall economic activity for each assembly constituency in a given year. Lastly, we use census data to measure long-run changes in development outcomes. So we measure changes in literacy rate, employment rate, sharement as agricultural labor as an outcome variable. We find insignificant and muted results everywhere in the analysis. And let me show you one of the tables. This is a table telling us the long-term development outcomes from synchronized representation. In this table, we regress the changes in the share of elections over the period from 1977 to 2001 to the changes in the outcome variables as presented in the columns between the panel A shows you the results for the full sample, while in panel B, we do heterogeneity across constituencies which had synchronized representation in the highest tier size. And you see we have insignificant results everywhere. We therefore conclude that synchronized elections have rather muted economic benefits, and the benefits to occur through synchronized representation. As policy implications, we think in this paper, we convincingly document synchronized elections in India lead to substantial changes in the way voters process information and they make their choices, leading to changes in electoral outcomes. outcomes and potentially government formation as well. At the same time, there are no clear economic benefits of synchronization. So this can have important policy it can have important policy implications on the degree of effective decentralization in India. And the decentralization is a well-documented phenomena to deliver better governance when the countries are linguistically and ethnically diverse, especially like India. And such a big regime change in election could actually also weaken the federal structure of states in India. Our results suggesting that the state issues take prominence in the synchronized elections, which is a bit contrary to the current debates. Lastly, we want to emphasize that this is the partial equilibrium effect, and an actual regime change could actually lead to much bigger general equilibrium consequences as well. To conclude, we find that in this paper, we examine the consequences of synchronized elections on the national and state assembly elections in India by exploiting the natural varying electoral cycles across the 2 tiers of governance. We show that probability that same party wins at both the tiers goes up by 21% when the elections are synchronized. And that the voters exhibit reduced split ticket voting, and they suffer from greater decision complexity when they vote in the synchronized elections. So therefore, any policy change about synchronized election should also consider the behavioral consequences of synchronization. Thank you so much.